preface, the author was actually invited by the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, in the late 1970s to consult and advise with him on what was happening in American culture. So the author is a historian. He's a real kind of unique writer because he's interdisciplinary. So he pulls from history, but he also pulls from psychology, but not psychology as we know it today, which is this kind of broad, sort of reductive, like all of these different types of psychology. No. Christopher Lasch pulls from what's called psychoanalysis, which is the OG form of psychology. You guys know what OG stands for?
Original gangster.
Original gangster. Yeah, the psychoanalysts are the original gangster. They're the first ones, and they have a godfather figure by the name of Freud, who's you have all the dumb jokes about with the cigars, and everybody thinks he's too negative, and oh this and oh. But Freud actually said that narcissism is constitutive of being a human being. Everyone's narcissistic. But there's different levels of narcissism. There's primary and secondary narcissism. And so, Freud was someone who's deeply influenced by myths. And one of the most famous myths from Greek society is obviously Narcissus and Echo, which I had you guys watch that cute little video, the cartoon. What is the myth of, what is this? Could somebody just sort of briefly say what it is? Because this guy, Narcissus, is staring at his reflection in the pond, and it's similar actually to Socrates, insofar as what the myth of Narcissus is about is an oracle who tells Narcissus that his fate will be a certain way. And his fate will be a certain way, which is he will have everlasting life unless he discovers who he is. Unless he, what they call in psychology, self-actualizes. So, he can be free without that knowledge, or he can be free without that realization. But there's a woman who comes into his life who thinks that he's quite cute, and a series of events happen, mostly accidental, and he sees his face. And of course the talk of the town is that he's like the cutest guy, right? So he sees his face, and then what happens?
You get obsessed with his face.
Yeah, he basically becomes obsessed, and it's like a trance, kind of, and no one can break him from it. And they refer to it in the myth as love. It's like a type of love that he has, but it's not there's many different types of love, right? This is a self-love which eats him up, and eventually he burns away into flames. So it doesn't go too well for him. And the oracle was correct. So what you have here is a sort of myth which is talking about the way in which the self relates to the world outside of the self, objects. And Narcissus never sees himself objectified. He never sees himself as an object. And life can go on, normal and so on, until he does. And what happens? It's a total freeze. He's totally frozen in the image of himself. So, from this myth, and this is a nice thing, it's kind of like a theory, what can we derive from it? What can we apply from it?
The destruction of loving yourself too much.
Yeah. What else? Like, destruction, yes, but something about how difficult it is to break from the fixation. If you guys are taking notes on your laptops, are you taking notes on it? Are you taking notes on it? You taking notes on your laptop? You?
Oh, me?
Yes?
I don't have a laptop. It's your phone.
Oh, that's amazing. Wow. had the sheen, like a shiny thing. So that's actually a very significant theme, which is perceptions of objects exterior to the self. Have a correspondence to how we view the self, let's say. Now, I've actually done a lot of work in psychoanalysis, and so what I'm going to try to share with you today is basically some seminal points. So please, write these down. I'll share the PowerPoint on Canvas as well. But in essence, what we're looking at here is a phenomenon which is a response. This tendency, the narcissistic tendency in the personality, is a response to, first and foremost, self-preservation. This was actually Freud's whole idea, that narcissism is primary because the self, the agency of the self, what he called the ego, has to come to terms with the world and other people and other things in the world that coexist with the ego. And in order to do that, you develop what Freud called ego ideals. And ego ideals are really, really important for how we don't remain narcissistic. If you have an ineffectivity or a failure of ego ideals, you have often a problem of narcissism. So what is an ego ideal? Well, an ego ideal would be a type of identification that you have with a mentor, or a coach, or your father, or an institution. So let's say you go to Marymount University and you have pride in going to Marymount University. Well, the meaning that you identify with this institution is not reducible just to the institution itself. It's much bigger than that for you. It allows you to do certain things. If you feel pride in being a saint, being a part of this university, that's because, there was a culture that probably encouraged you to form that type of identification. And so what psychoanalysis tries to show is that there is a kind of origin point to ego ideals. And one of the key origin points is the institution of the family, obviously. Paternal authority. So paternal authority becomes the ground zero, becomes the base by which we construct our ego ideals. And this is actually why we're turning to a consideration of the family in the latter part of our class. Family is one site, it's not the only site, where stable, this is very important, stable ego ideals can operate. So what that means is that you can make investments into friendships, into relationships with others, based on the model of the ego ideal that you were taught in your family. And there's a certain respect that you must have for women. There's a certain way you must comport yourself in this social situation. The ego ideal is also a restraint on bad behavior, right? So there is a bit of repression, self-imposed limitations and constraints imposed on ego ideal identifications. So a society based on narcissism is a society which actually has an ineffective ego ideal going on. Does that make sense? It's not just the family that's ineffective, it's institutions, it's authority figures, all the way down the line. So, Christopher Lasch is wanting to make an argument that this phenomenon is so ubiquitous, is so widespread, that we find it in virtually every part of society, from people that write fiction, to the university, to the family, to popular culture, all the way to the presidency. This is a phenomenon which is becoming extremely widespread. We in our class are studying capitalism, and as you'll see later, capitalism has a role to play in this intensification of narcissism, according to Christopher Lasch. So that's very important that we analyze that from a causal perspective of what's actually driving this. So, we have this thing called the ego. We also have this thing, according to Freud, called the superego, which is very interesting. It's kind of like the relay system by which the ego communicates to the social field around it. So it's the way in which the ego interiorizes the perceived law of the society. So you could say it's kind of like the conscience of man. That's kind of a good way to understand the superego. There is an injunction which we internalize, and it's a very important part of like our constitution as a self, as a person. It's a regulating force on our behavior, on our actions. It's also a force of restraint on our actions often. So the interesting thing about a superego is that it changes based on where you are. If we are in a society like America today, the superego is going to be internalized by people in a different way than it was, say, 30 years ago. Or if we are in, say, Saudi Arabia, the superego is going to be internalized in a different way than if we are in Texas, right? There may be similarities, but it's a link to the social, is the important point, right? So, Lasch's biggest thesis, if you want to locate like his core thesis, it is that we have a decline in the effectivity of ego ideal in these authority figures, in institutions, in religion, in belief. That's common. But what replaces it is a demand from a superego, because that's the other thing that the superego does, is it makes a demand upon you. Which is why the superego is most often associated with guilt. So maybe you could think about an example like in your own life where the last time you felt guilty. You're just interior, you don't have to share that or whatever, but that would be an example of the way in which the superego is operating, you see? So, everybody with me so far? I know that some of these concepts might be kind of new, but this is psychoanalysis, ABCs of psychoanalysis, Psychoanalysis 101, whatever. Very important stuff, right? If the ego ideal is ineffective, what we're left with is a society where the demand of the superego is highly confused and contradictory. Because the demand of the superego is, in fact, for you to live without the masters, without the authority figures. Live without them. That's the demand of society in the post-1965 period that Lasch is talking about. In other words, the encouragement of citizens to realize themselves, is to realize themselves in an inhibition-free manner, where one no longer needs to necessarily have a commitment to these old ego ideals. We're beyond that now. So at the one hand, it kind of sounds liberating. You could see how that might sound liberating, right? And you can also see how, in a very interesting way, remember the new Spirit of Capitalism that I was talking about 2 classes ago? What was the whole thesis with that text? It's a very simple thesis. The protest movements of the 60s and 70s were eventually adapted and mirrored by corporate management culture to create a workplace that would adhere to the liberationist principles that were implicit in the protest movements. Does that make sense? They adapted, they integrated those demands, which were kind of revolutionary demands, but ultimately it's been proven this is not a full, complete revolution. It was a revolution which was adapted by corporate life, by capitalist system, and so on. In a similar way, the collapse of the ego ideals of authority figures in life comes also out of the 60s movement, because that's exactly their demands. We don't want a life of rigid norms. We don't want stuck-up parents. We don't want to have to fit into your box. We don't want to have the nuclear family. We want freedom. We want mobility. We don't need to serve old masters. You see what I mean? Well, according to Christopher Lasch, all of that backfired. So your parents' critique of the hippies may turn out to be correct. Just kidding. Now, I want to share this with you, which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is probably one of the most famous, this is from the branch of psychology called humanistic psychology. It's a little bit different than psychoanalysis, but we have an ascending set of needs which begin with a kind of subsistence at the biological, physiological level and continue on to, the second tier of subsistence, which is like basic security, money. You need to have like a kind of stable job. That's level 2. Level 3 is, you need to have some connectivity to a sense of belonging to some other people. You can't be radically isolated. Level 4 is you need recognition. So level 4 is an entry point of the ego ideal. Level 4 is an entry point of ego ideal, if we want to use Lasch's and the psychoanalytic language. Well, in the culture of narcissism, we get stunted here, here, and here. Self-actualization, the highest form, becomes something which actually collapses on its very, when it stands up. It doesn't seem, according to Lasch, to actually have there's something always missing, which is why you may remember when he's writing in this book, he's sharing examples of people that write fiction, poets, writers, storytellers. And he said, something very significant changed in the way that they narrate their stories. You may remember this part, I love this part, which is that when they speak to the reader, they seek to identify the reader, identify with the reader in such a way where they emphasize the hollowed out interior of their own lives. In other words, the culture of narcissism produces a type of recognition that actually on the inside I'm really nothing. On the inside I actually have no substance. And that actually might become a source for like a catharsis. Or rather, that might become a source for this. But it's a negative source because it's like a mourning for a loss. So, a big focus of Lasch is obviously on what's called the self-help culture, which rose concurrent to this movement. So the self-help culture was trying to satisfy level 4, recognition, self-esteem, and so on. But Lasch makes a very strong case that it too ultimately became unfulfilling for people. It replaced religion. It replaced religion. That's very important. And remains stuck here somehow. Because like I said, one of the other factors of the culture of narcissism is a failure of initiation. What is the initiation? What is the concept of initiation?
Like becoming a part of, being accepted into, right?
Yeah. Have like a circumcision party for a young boy in some religious traditions. I'm sure that hurts very much. You have a bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah. You have a whole branch of Protestant Christianity which actually says once the child reaches puberty, they're given the choice to accept Christianity. It's called the Anabaptist movement. I like that idea personally. I think that's quite cool. As opposed to just saying, you're baptized as a baby, even though you don't have your wits about you. You see? What's another example of an initiation?
Quinceañeras. Quinceañeras.
What's that? Oh, yes. Yeah. In the Mexican culture, yeah. Okay. Those are kind of cultural initiation. But what about personal initiation? Say, leaving the house to go to college. Is that a form of initiation? Well, very important point here. Personal initiation points, maturing, having milestones, without ego ideals, becomes a lot more difficult. Which is why the Kavanaugh case is quite interesting with his friend who wrote the book, Wasted, a memoir of a Gen X drunk. Well, he's also written several articles. This guy's Mike Judge is his name. He also wrote several articles about how the Gen X generation, because the culture of narcissism is not talking about millennials. They're talking more about your parents. That's very important. They're talking more about your parents. And Mike Judge says, really, my generation is plagued by an inability of initiation. There's something stunted in our capacity to initiate and grow. So our objective is to understand the causal factors of that. How does that make you feel, though, first of all? Is that kind of like a daunting reality for you? Or is this kind of the way of the world now? Yeah? Well, one thing we should avoid is the sophist position, which is everything is all relative, and that's just your opinion, man. Let's definitely avoid that orientation when we read Christopher Lasch, because that's not what he's saying. He's making a theoretical claim based on a lot of labor of analysis. So it's substantial. What I'm talking about is not merely my opinion, nor is it just Christopher Lasch's opinion. No, he's putting forward a more sophisticated argument. So, what does it mean to have stunted self-actualization? What does it mean that the fifth level of Maslow's pyramid of needs is somehow stunted? Well, narcissism comes about in that context. Remember when I said Freud said that narcissism is about self-preservation? This is ultimately why, you should be a little bit more compassionate to a narcissist. It's difficult to trust them and so on if they truly are a narcissist. But from this perspective, what we're learning now is that, frankly, if narcissism is so pervasive in society, it's a response to some problem. So I've located 5 points. Changes to family life. Now, all of you have great admiration for your parents, at least most of you do. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the function of the institution of the family changing. This is not about, well, I still respect my father and he still initiates me, he still inspires me. Unfortunately, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about here is something more structural, more societal based. And Lasch uses the example of the way in which you see in prior forms of social life, the function of the family had a mediation role with all of the various levels of the pyramid. Like, there was strong tradition, there was a certain regimentation, often tied to labor, frankly. I don't know about you, but I actually worked for my father's small business for many years of my youth. And of course, back in the day, that's highly common, right? So the modern society, the proliferation of consumerism, the proliferation of technology, other factors, has led to a sense in which the paternal function is often replaced with experts. What do I mean by that? Well, the knowledge of what it takes to push a child through this society, the family lacks the sufficient or proficient knowledge to do that unto themselves. So they must go out. And this is why, like, Hillary Clinton wrote this famous book called It Takes a Village to Raise a Child. Everybody criticized her for that book, but this is exactly what is at stake. In other words, and we're going to see this when we look at Melinda Cooper's book on the family, the family loses its stability in this period of time. And this period of time is about 1965 onward. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is that expertise culture proliferates, and there becomes a type of resentment that becomes very common amongst average people around the bureaucratization of everyday life. So this causes an effect of a decline in trust in institutions, because everything is administered, everything is managed. Like, I'll give you an example. I was recently on the plane and I watched this film called Leave No Trace, and it's actually about an Iraq War vet who is basically trying to disappear in the woods of Oregon because he has such bad trauma from the war, but he has his daughter with him. Has anybody seen this movie? That's pretty cool. I'd recommend it. It's hard to watch, but it's good. They just want to lead a life completely outside of civilization, right? And then we learn eventually that he's kind of traumatized, and that's kind of what's driving it. But what you see in the film is that literally he cannot achieve this. Like, everywhere he turns, there's like some apparatus or some police force or some securitization thing that's breathing down his neck. So bureaucracy alienates in its own way. Point number 2. Point number 3, it's beautiful that Lasch even mentions this, obviously because he wrote Culture of Narcissism before the rise of the internet. But he's already noting that the proliferation of an image-based society is creating a danger. And we can think about this from the standpoint of what caused a narcissist to destruct. We should always remember that. What was it? Fixation on the image. Number 4, we have a unique form of commodity consumption, what we call consumerism. And this is a unique form which really comes about in the financial period of late capitalism. Now, consumerism is largely based on a premise of what they call planned obsolescence. And by that we mean commodities have a certain artificiality, a replaceability, a reproducibility built into them. So the phone has a life of 2 years, and we all know that. And then I have to get a new one. So there's a certain sense in which commodities no longer have a real existence. They have a kind of orchestrated or fake artificial existence. 5, the way we cope with all of this, these changes in society, is through therapy, through self-help. But this self-help does not produce a true initiation. It does not often produce a true change. For a true narcissist, they don't want it to produce a change. Just feeding off of it is itself sufficient. So, as I mentioned before, there is a sense in which interior life, remember, what's the demand of the superego? Live without barriers. Live without barriers. It's a naked type of existence. You're sort of thrown. It's a thrown type of existence. Random, chance-filled. Of course, it's quite exciting in many ways, but it produces some psychic negative effects. Number 1, there is a sense in which it is futile to commit oneself to a cause that's greater than them. Now, of course, I'm not saying this is the case for everyone, but the culture allows and reinforces that sense of a lack of fidelity to a big cause. Number 2, we may have a love of the image, but since we have a lack of the ego ideals, it's highly difficult for us to form love bonds with others based on the old model of love, which requires what? A profound level of sacrifice. I mean, today, young people, largely through market mediations, engage with potential intimate partners through a highly calculated regimen, highly calculated, not only of personal interests, but of backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, racial backgrounds. All of these filters have to be met. You could almost say that love is the one place where chance and randomization doesn't happen. So the profound irony is that we used to criticize cultures that did arranged marriage. But with the marketization of love now, it virtually is arranged in my view. So that's a big one. Number 3, when we talked about entrepreneurship, obviously there's many facets of entrepreneurship. However, in the workplace, leadership in the workplace has a tendency to see success more as an effect of the impression that you receive from others. So if you receive a validation for your work from others, this is more sufficient than actually achieving something with your team at the job. And then feelings of hollowness inside. Self-help becomes a discourse by which you can cope with and accept the hollowness that you feel already. Self-help does not necessarily produce a solution for how to get rid of the hollowness. It basically says embrace it. Right? What are the consequences of this type of society? Number one, and I see this in some of the papers that I read from college students, an absolute relativism of knowledge. Everything is merely perspectival. Universality of truth is completely out the window. That's not only because we have a collapse of the ego ideal function, it's also because we literally cannot find a point by which we could construct something truly universal in the world. So this is a bit tricky. The way to get out of relativism is not necessarily to individually declare that one's speech or one's opinion is somehow universal. No, the way to get out of relativism is like only through a collective effort, which is something maybe we can talk about at a later time. Another effect, and this is, I think, very interesting, is that if society becomes the superego, no longer like the church, the army, or the parents, or this or the institution, the way in which we interiorize that is actually miserable, or can be miserable. Because our placement within society is often reducible to a sense that everything is ascribed vis-a-vis our merit and our ability. But the first thing you're going to hear from me in my class is that this is not the case. No, we have other forces at play here. Sometimes things are reducible to ability, but oftentimes they're not. But if people are internalizing that everything is reducible to their ability and their capacities, well, how do you think people are going to feel? They're going to make the hollowness even worse. No? Depending on where they land and so on. You see my point? The 60s generation, and Lasch cites all of the famous revolutionary figures that converted to the self-help discourse in lieu of the notion that we can do collective organization, collective solidarity. This is actually probably one of his most novel and important insights. That there was a betrayal on behalf of a certain generation. What were they betraying? What were they betraying? What were they betraying? No.
All I can think of is the part where it was like love, because like they're focusing on their own self-fulfillment, so like for being cool as a child, that's not right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the basic point is that the heady period of, say, 60s and 70s uprisings, largely against Vietnam War, but also broader than that. It was also sort of a cultural and sexual revolution. The free love movement, that's a part of it, definitely. What was the premise of those demands? Was the premise that social change is based on your own choice and your choice alone? No, God, no, that's not what the premise was at all. No, please, no. By God, no. You understand? The point is actually there's a collective source of energy which we are mutating and pushing consciousness and social change towards. But at a certain point, they kind of threw their hands up in resignation and said, this project isn't working anymore. And they adopted a life of a much more interiorized orientation. Jane Fonda's a classic case in point. There is a certain filmmaker by the name of Adam Curtis. If you ever get a chance, he has a film called HyperNormalization. And a really nice film that highlights this theme super well if you're interested in it. If anyone would like to watch that film and write about it, I would be very tickled. Okay, fourth point, as terms of consequences, recognition becomes destabilized. Have you ever been in a traditional culture? The way recognition works in a traditional culture is not pervasive. It's not like, I need general recognition. That's not how it works. No, you need specific recognition. It's very, locatable. The uncle, the father, the grandfather. Very specific figures. You see points. In a culture of narcissism, there's no specific points. You just need recognition. You see the difference? What do you think about that difference? It's interesting, right? How you thought about it that way? It was interesting, right? You choose who you want to get recognition from. Maybe somebody could give a counter argument to me and Christopher Lasch by saying, hey, you're being too critical, man. It's good that we can choose who we get recognition from. Maybe somebody could make that argument, right? And to some extent, that is true. In my own life, it's like that. I had no one in my family that was an academic or interested in the world of books. I didn't have many books growing up. I found the books, and then I said I want to get some recognition from that world. So there is a liberating feature of our life. It's not all doom and gloom. I try to make you happy and sad at the same time. Yeah? It's impossible to live in a society where others' achievements matter, self-reinforcing, or resentment abounds. If there is a generalized sense that I need recognition for my self-esteem, but I don't have a clear point of where I find it, people who get recognition and I don't become a dumb, inverted competition. That's a false competition. And you all know it's false, but you can't help but feel it. This is a culture of narcissism. That's something you have to choose to confront and reject. But our culture actually doesn't give you any tools on how to do that. It's up to you. So, historically, as Max Weber outlined, there are 3 stages of the unfolding of how we got here, of how we got to the culture of narcissism as we have it post-1965. The Protestant work ethic was strong ego ideal, source of salvation clearly marked, God, love, family, work, all that stuff is placed. It's a fairly stable psychical horizon. And you guys remember Weber's whole argument there. But what Lasch points out, and I think this is a really nice point that he makes, in stage one, you already have the seed that is planted for a narcissistic personality. So inherent within Protestant individualism is the tendency towards this type of radical narcissism. You could almost say it's waiting to burst out of the seams. So, one thing we should be careful of is feeling nostalgic for a return to this. I think in some ways you could understand the Christian right, fundamentalist culture, movements like Focus on the Family, as precisely an interest to return to stage one. Right? Your uncle from the South? Your grandfather? Huh? They're actually not stage one, they're more stage two. Stage two is basically the GI generation. This is Lasch's kind of framework. Here we have the development of ego-ideal identifications that are very normative, that are a lot more stabilized. What Lasch points out, and what we're going to look at in the next couple of weeks, to the end of the class, is that what allowed for this period to take place was largely afforded by the stability ushered in by the New Deal, which provided massive, massive state subsidies for education, home ownership, retirement, pensions, and so on. The GI Bill, for example, case in point. A whole generation receives free college. Well, that generation constructed a social world which somewhat kept the narcissism in check to a degree. So my identifications with institutions, with other people, was dependent upon this thing called the public sphere, a place where anonymous activity can take place. And one thing that Lasch points out, I think, very nicely, is that post-65, the composition of the public sphere began to erode. What is the public sphere in the classical sense of it? It's actually a place where dialogue with strangers, dialogues with otherness, are eligible to occur irrespective of class distinction. There was a kind of symbolic lack of resentment towards otherness, towards others. Yet, catapult to the culture of narcissism, something starts to erode about the shared capacity of the public sphere. We still have the public sphere, but it's kind of mediated by different apparatuses which are largely dictated by the market. So the public sphere starts to change. Stage 3, of course, is 1965, what I'm saying, to the present. Now, what we could say is that we need to have a Christopher Lasch, Culture of Narcissism, Part 2. Maybe one day I'll write that book and re-periodize exactly what he means, you know? Because I don't think it's all homogenous from 65 to the present. I think there's been a lot of changes and fluctuations. Like, for example, narcissism for millennials is fundamentally different than narcissism for the Gen X generation. It's a radically different thing, right? So there actually needs to be a lot of new thinking about how the culture of narcissism has mutated. But what we do know, just to recapitulate, is that superego identification, which is basically what? What is that again? It's a kind of generalized palette of society without ego ideals. So it's just like a general social demand. One of my favorite examples is the Fight Club example. In the movie Fight Club, the character Brad Pitt calls his father, and it's a nice point about the failure of initiation. When he says, "Father, what's next in my life? Moved out of the house, I went to college, I bought a house, I got married," and then it ends. There's like all of these things you're supposed to do, but they're not necessarily sanctioned by some force which legitimates them. So he becomes empty inside, and he wants to find something higher meaning, and he creates Fight Club. Why does he create Fight Club?
You're not supposed to talk about Fight Club. That's not a Fight Club.
That's true, but why do you think people are drawn to Fight Club? Do you think it has anything to do with this idea we're talking about of the lack of an interior life? The need to fill it in? Yeah? So, consequence is that recognition, how we receive recognition, is highly heterogeneous and varied. Highly idiosyncratic. And you can see one of the consequences from that is that relativism prevails. Everything is merely your opinion. You can see a total through line to the ridiculous concept of fake news that we have to deal with today. You can see this as like a total, like, train that's crashed, you know? So, this is why I assigned this book, because frankly, it gives us a wonderful trajectory to understand our present moment, in my opinion. One thing we should hit on here is understanding the difference between stage 2 and stage 3. Again, stage 2 is the post-war boom. Your grandparents or great-grandparents. Most of these people are in their 80s now, or 90s. Christopher Lasch says that in stage 2, the invisible hand of the market gave way to the invisible hand of the institution. In other words, the relationship between institutional life and the market was functioning well. It functioned well. Remember Adam Smith's whole point. What you feed into the market is an invisible hand which self-corrects. Hence, Adam Smith is the godfather of capitalism. Because for him, the market can work. It can have this self-correcting sort of notion. Well, what Lasch says is that it did work then in stage 2. It did work. And for the psychology of the citizenry, they had these socially determined points of identification. Right? Belief in institutions. I mean, you should look in the post-2008 trajectory of the trust that citizens have in institutions. Corporate institutions, government institutions, institutions of finance, and so on. It's not a pretty picture. It's not a pretty picture. It's almost like a story of a pretty rapid decline in trust. So what he's saying is something happened to the market and it no longer produced the same balance with institutions. And one of the biggest effects of this break is the destabilization of the family. So we're faced with a very challenging ethical problem, in my view, which is the question of return to the past or not. And what past? Do we return to the resurrection of the old ghost of this mediation between the market and institutions where it worked well? I mean, this was the sine qua non of the Steve Bannon wing of the Donald Trump phenomenon. That's precisely Bannon's wish. To return life in America. Obviously, it had a racial inflection, though, because he wanted to argue that certain segment of the white population in America has received negative spoils, negative kickbacks from globalization, and they need to be given this transfer of state wealth, similar to what stage 2 received, in order to lift them up. So the irony there is that Steve Bannon's in essence basically saying we need a welfare state policy for immiserated poor white people in the hinterlands and rural areas of America. Right? Which is crazy. It's crazy because it's racially segmented. I mean, it ignores the sufferings of people of color. This is ludicrous, right? But everyone knows that whatever has happened in the post-65 financial capitalist configuration is not working well. It's not working well. There's something rotten in Denmark. It's not functioning well. So the thesis that Lasch puts forward, and you see this in the preface of the book, is that the relationship of the market has a direct role on the stability of the psychical health of individuals in the society. There's like a causal relationship between the two. Hence, that's why we're studying capitalism. It's much more than just a sort of isolated economic system. Right? You see my point? So, that's basically what I want to say about Christopher Lasch. Comments or thoughts are welcome.
I have a comment. So he's just talking about the Generation X, right?
No, he's not talking about that. He's talking about a pervasive tendency in the culture writ large. He's not just speaking this generation is narcissistic. He's saying the entire culture is moving in this direction. But it just so happens to be occurring within the time that Gen X is starting to blossom and come onto the scene. But it affects across all generations, yeah. Does this help you understand the Protestant work ethic thing a little bit more? Good. Yes. What do you guys think about this whole thesis on recognition? How do you mediate that yourself? I thought it was the nicest point we developed so far today was this point about the contrast between stage 2 and stage 3, where what might be an opening in stage 3 is precisely this freedom to find your own node or your own site for recognition. There's something liberating about that, right? If you're born in a rural community and you manage to get out of it, which is very hard to get out of it often for material reasons, and you discover a passion which your family had no coordinates to develop for you, but you found it on your own, there's something beautiful about that. And that should be welcomed and celebrated, in my view. And so stage 3 of this model opens that possibility. That's the positive. What's the negative? What's the negative of that? The negative is that people often lack the coordinates by how to discover that in the first place. You see my point? Like, people feel adrift to a certain extent. What's going to happen? How do I... You see what I mean? So it becomes a question of initiation. How does initiation occur? Without initiation, and this is actually the big point of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis has a theory of what's called Oedipus, from the Oedipus drama of Sophocles. You've heard of that, right? What's the story of Oedipus? Does anybody remember?
A man is fated to murder his father and marry his mother.
Mhm.
And in order to make this not happen, they send the baby away. 18 years later, guy not knowing who he was, ends up killing someone who happens to be his father, and then wins the Queen of Thebes as a prize. So ends up marrying his mother, and then after he finds out all this stuff, he blinds himself, and then his daughters need to take care of him.
Yeah. Wow. So once again, the oracle is always right. But is it? You could think of a society of narcissism as one in which there are no oracles. I think that's a nice way to think about it. It's a different kind of freedom. That's why they say often that our society is post-Oedipal. Or somehow, because you see, Freud would take the Oedipus myth, and he would argue that it is a theory largely having to do with initiation. Initiation into a new form of becoming, a new form of desire. How does one form a new desire? Have you ever formed a new desire? What does it mean to form a new desire? What is a desire? Well, what psychoanalysis says about desire is that desire is not something which you yourself own. It's not something that's a property. I can't go to the store and purchase it. I don't possess it. But I kind of long for it, right? And there's a lot of, very interesting kind of motifs in literature about how actually possessing the desire is like a monstrous thing itself. So desire is like a fire that you have to be very careful with. But it is a fire, it is, let's say, a potency which enables you to transform yourself, to become somebody different, right? Which is precisely what the culture of narcissism is unable to do. This is his whole point about self-help. Self-help keeps you kind of in this static place where you're just accepting a feeling of emptiness inside, but you're not really truly changing the conditions to no longer feel that way. It's a coping mechanism, let's say. Well, what therapy vis-a-vis Lasch and Freud, what they mean by therapy is actually breaking from your habits, actually changing them completely. So the question of our time, of our culture, is largely this question of how do we produce a real change? And this is actually a question that philosophers will ask and come up with many different answers to. But does anybody want to share like a personal anecdote of something very embarrassingly personal? Just kidding. No, but does anybody want to share? What are your thoughts on this thesis? You don't have to share anything personal, but you can speak kind of more general, more abstract. Please.
I really liked it. I think it rung true. A lot of times I dismiss philosophy because it has no connection to me. But I really liked how he tied in religion with it. And although he didn't really talk about it that much, it kind of drew me in, obviously. And I liked that a lot, this connection to that. And everything he said rung true to me. I was like, yeah, I see this. Yep.
So then what is the consequence for a religious believer then, if we take the thesis of Lasch and we take it seriously?
You mean in relation to initiation and stuff, right?
Well, no, yes, that, but what does he, first of all, what does he say about it?
About initiation.
No, about religion.
Oh, well, he talks about the Protestant work ethic and how that was bad, and then, or planted seeds for bad things. And then also
also how religion has been completely replaced, and it's like with self-help and like therapy and stuff.
Yes.
And that,
exactly.
like 100%, that's true. Like you see, like they talk about in Europe, like the churches are dying, like the populations are just dying, like young people don't come anymore, like
Yeah.
it's just old people. And they're having every church everywhere has a hard time getting young people to come to
Yeah.
church. And
You could almost say born again culture, which is something that grew concurrent to this period of time in the 70s. Because you have to understand, in the 70s, Christianity in America underwent an awakening. And the born again Protestant evangelical culture blossomed. Largely in response also to the revolutionary uprising of the 60s, in response against it. This was combined also with a self-help type of inflection, this type of Christianity. However, implicit in it was a desire, I think, to break from the culture of narcissism. And I would even say evangelical born-again culture is a call from the wilderness for a true initiation, a strong conversion. What's more of an initiation or a break, a true becoming, a true change, than this radical affirmation of being born again, right? So, Lasch doesn't talk too much about that. He kind of is talking more about high culture. So I think he might benefit from reading that phenomenon as a response to the culture of narcissism.
It was nice that he didn't like 100% reject it, because a lot of the time you see, like with Marx or like other writers, like they 100% reject it, and they're like, no, like we're not even gonna talk about it, we're not gonna look at it, it has nothing to do with anything. So it was interesting that he like threw in it a little bit there.
Well, Marx definitely rejects bourgeois religion, but he rejects it on the basis that it is a reflection of an oppressive class. He does not reject it on the basis that it is somehow metaphysically wrong or something like that. So it's more to the story there. But that's good. Thank you for sharing that. That's really helpful. Yeah, because you see, the Oedipus thing is very interesting, because what it ultimately also comes down to, aside from this theory on initiation, is what? The necessity of paternal figures for one's initiation. That's like one of Freud's major insights, that in fact, one must kill the father in order to initiate. You kill them out of love, but you have to kill them. I'm not kidding. Symbolically. There has to be a true break, in some sense. The father is, in the Freudian theory of Oedipus, like an impossible figure. It's a father that allows for the ego the stability of identifications to happen, but at the same time, one must also get beyond the father. That's a very important point, actually. If anyone's interested in that psychoanalysis stuff, somebody's a psychology major here. Who is?
I'm a psych minor.
Oh, cool. Well, if you're interested in psychoanalysis, this is like my bailiwick. This is my field. I do a lot of work there. I'm highly interested in it myself. So I'll be happy to chat more about it. Yeah, because Freud would actually argue that society is only given a stability from its origin point upon the murder of the primal father. And so he reads the origin of civilization from that perspective. It's a very strange idea if you think about it. But if you read enough into it, it actually begins to make sense. But I don't want you to read that literally, like, how do I kill my father to become initiated? I'm not saying that. It's more at the level of desire. what it means to be Oedipalized is to accept the loss of being unable to possess the phallus in the family. So like, there is a struggle within a family between mother and father, which goes unexpressed. The child latches onto one or the other at certain intervals. But to truly break free is to put down the struggle for the phallus. But then, of course, what the hell is a phallus? And I'm not going to get into that. But yes, psychoanalysis is OG. I highly recommend it, that you read it, because it's good for your soul. Because it really, really, really helps you understand stage 2 to 3. It really helps you understand like how to better live in a world without functioning ego ideals. Seriously. Any questions? I really love this stuff. Like, this really makes me excited. I'm not kidding. I'm like, I think this book is splendid. I would love to write a book like this. So clear, so rich in examples, so lucid, such a nice commentary on our culture, you know? Bravo. So, why don't we take a break and then we'll hear from students. We may want to get out a little early because I have a Halloween party. That's okay. Depending on how long you guys go. Is that cool?
Yeah, of course, go ahead.
No, it's their turn next. So we're beholden to your schedule, okay?